Welcome to the Good Faith Podcast. I'm your host, Curtis Chang. And the Good Faith Podcast is where friends who follow Jesus help each other make sense of the world. Now, much commentary over the last few months have been expended about what Donald Trump is doing to the world. The torrent of actions by design have sent many into a sense of disorientation and shock precisely by their immediacy. Now, what's immediately has happened in the last few months really matters. Consequential things are happening, will continue to happen. But I can't help but think that as Christians, we are called perhaps to a longer and deeper time frame. Maybe one way to put it would be, maybe the important question is less, what is Donald Trump doing to the world? And instead, what is Trump revealing about the world? Because the reality is, what Trump reveals about the world by his actions probably points to realities that will far outlast and probably also far preceded his administration. And that's why I was so excited to have as my guest Andy Crouch. Andy is a longtime friend of the Good Faith Podcast. He's a partner for theology and culture at Praxis. And, well, he helps us think deeply about the world. So welcome back, Andy, to the Good Faith Podcast.
Thank you, Curtis. It is always good to get to talk.
Well, so let's start with actually some fundamental beginnings. When we are thinking about the world, how are Christians to think about their political rulers? Like, just how important are political rulers in the Christian worldview about the world?
That's a great way to begin, I think. And for us, it all begins, in the story of the first Christians and our Lord Jesus. And I think what's kind of striking, one of the most striking things in some ways about the New Testament is the dog that doesn't bark in the New Testament. If you're usually listening for barking, but every once in a while, non-barking is notable. And what doesn't bark in the New Testament is kind of the presence and power of Caesar. Now, Caesar, this is Octavian, Augustus Caesar, who's ruling the whole known world effectively at the time. And is a big deal. He's being celebrated contemporaneously with Jesus being celebrated as the divine son who is bringing good news to the whole world. We have literal inscriptions from the first few decades of the Common Era celebrating Augustus Caesar in terms of the good news of the Son of God who's bringing peace to the world and prosperity to the world. So, and it also, so he's being celebrated as good news because he's replaced this kind of tottering, no longer fully functioning Roman Republic with an empire that actually does function in many ways for its most prominent citizens in a very effective way. And even for the hinterlands is bringing a level of stability and prosperity and so forth. Also, of course, is the stick, like that's the carrot. The other side is the stick. Like he has the legions, he has the power, he's printing the money. He is a very dominant presence. And in light of that, it's amazing how little he shows up in the pages of, and in a sense, the preoccupations of the New Testament authors and even Jesus himself, along with the local vassals. So the Herodian dynasty that's ruling Judea at this time by kind of the grant of Caesar. They style themselves as kings. They play a ruling role. And they have real power. Jesus' own cousin, John the Baptist, is beheaded by them after he gets on the wrong side of one of the Herods. But when Herod wants to see Jesus, Jesus is like, I don't have time for that, fox. Like, I'm on my way to Jerusalem. I've got bigger fish to fry than the local king. And when Jesus is asked about paying taxes to Caesar, he's like, well, bring me a coin. They bring him a coin. Of course, the only face that's ever on a coin is the emperor's face. And yeah, Jesus has this sort of humble hilarity to ask, whose face is this? And then when they say it's Caesar's, he's like, well, give back to Caesar what's Caesar's. Like, what's the big deal? So throughout the New Testament, like, in spite of attempts by modern people who want to find sort of a subversive element, because after all, the early Christians do not worship Caesar as Lord and will go to their death rather than call him Lord.
Yeah.
So there's a real contest between the followers of Jesus and, in a sense, the followers of Caesar. And yet in spite of our kind of desire to make them into revolutionaries, they just aren't that interested in Caesar. They're so interested in Jesus, they can't be that interested in Caesar. And in lots of places where you would expect to find anti-imperial sentiment, it's not clearly there in the text. What is there is this overwhelming sense that a new Lord has come into the story through his death and resurrection, his cross and resurrection, has opened up real life, real peace, real prosperity, if you will, real human flourishing. And they're just so animated by who Jesus is as Lord of the world that the rival Lord who calls himself Caesar is of relatively little interest. So, I mean, that's the biblical background. And then, of course, we have 20 centuries of history to reckon with, especially in Christendom, where the king does end up very much intertwined with the church and styles himself for a millennium as the Holy Roman Emperor. And that holy means holy in a Christian sense, like aligned with the things of God, aligned with the priorities of God. And that complex relationship between, in a sense, the new Caesar, the new emperor, and the church, we can't ignore that. But and I think that's some of the we're living in the aftershocks, right, of the fusion of the political and the ecclesial for a thousand years plus in the West, and the West was made by that fusion, and we still live with the aftershocks of that fusion, in which, by the way, the ruler is no longer like he's in Romans, kind of there to enforce a certain minimal level of justice and bring a certain level of order and wield the sword in a way that the church never will. But now we get this imagination that the ruler is actually going to advance the cause of the gospel. The ruler is the one that the church depends on to expand its territory. The church's missionary efforts follow the ruler, the empire's kind of emissaries. So the missionaries follow the military, you might say. Um, and and all that is a very complex history. It goes without saying. Um, but I do think it's helpful to go back to the memory that's preserved for us in the New Testament, where that none of that is true. And Caesar is someone who's there. You have to reckon with him, and you may get in trouble with him, and he may take your life. But you are just on another wavelength. You're on another agenda. You're serving another Lord and Master, and you have a better story to tell than Caesar's ever going to be able to tell about his rule. I think some of that mindset is helpful maybe for us to recapture at moments when the world's rulers are doing, shall we say, very interesting things, which is happening in our own time, and it happens in many times. It's
Well,
happening
let's
to
just
us.
get more explicit. Like, is that a model for us of attention and focus in the moment when everything wants to get focused on one person, President Trump, and there's so much attention on them, and that's such a divergence, like you said, with the first century Christians. And sure, there was a lot of things that happened between that and now, but is this actually a moment to say, you know what, that dependence on one political ruler to advance a Christian view, that just needs to end. And we
Yeah.
really need to recapture and go back to the first century worldview. And this is the moment to do so. Actually, less, and in one sense, the call is less attention, not more.
Yes. Actually, I think the issue of attention is very profound. And it strikes me that, the rulers of this world in a way depend on getting attention, gaining and holding attention. This was certainly true, by the way, of Caesar, who had these, whether it was the fact that his face was on every coin or the incredible triumphal parades and monuments that Caesar erected, so you never forgot about him. This is also happening, by the way. The Herodians are doing the same thing. One of their main building projects is temples. Now, in the Gentile parts of their territory, they build Gentile temples, but in Jerusalem, there's this massive building project to rebuild the temple in the style of a Greco-Roman temple, not according to the pattern in the Old Testament. Um, and it's spectacular. And you go up on pilgrimage to Jerusalem, right? And it's up on of course, on a mountain. So as you're walking up the whole time, you're seeing Herod's temple, and you're being reminded of the greatness of Herod. And it actually speaks more of the greatness of Herod than the greatness of the Jewish people's God, because it's not designed the way the Jewish people's God said to design it. It's the way that Herod designed it. Much more spectacular, incredible work of architecture in a sense. And so, the rulers are always needing attention, and without even without distinguishing Donald Trump from anyone else who aspires to kind of public office in our media age, I mean, you sort of have to love the camera. Like, there's a joke,
Yeah.
we'll skip who it's about, but about a very famous senator, like the most dangerous place in Washington D.C. is between this individual and a camera. Like, don't get it, it's don't get in the way of that person and the camera. Well, that applies probably to almost everybody who's in politics in our media world. It certainly applies to Donald Trump. He's brilliant at attracting and holding and compelling attention. And this term, I think he's done better than in his first term. In his first term, to be honest, I barely ever heard his voice. I barely ever thought about him, partly because things weren't actually going that well in the first term in terms of actually getting stuff done. There was a lot of friction within the administration, even. And this administration has come in much more prepared to like maximize the moment, and it's hard to avoid him, right? On the other side, you have the one who deserves um, for our gaze to be eternally fixed on his face. There's this amazing song that we got to sing in church on Easter Sunday. It came out of Hillsong. It's called Anastasis. It's about the resurrection of Christ. And I think the last verse is about this vision of our gaze being transfixed by the face of Jesus when we all rise to the true life. Like, we're going to spend our whole true lives. In fact, like, if eternal life begins now, eternal life begins with our gaze fixed on the face of Jesus and utterly compelled by who he is and what he's like. And he is the total opposite of an attention seeker. He is reigning over this world as the ascended Lord, but he's invisible to this world, even though he is the world's true Lord. And even in his time as a human being living out his human life before his crucifixion, every time they try to elevate him to a position of kind of notoriety and fame, he demurs, he escapes out the back route, he takes a boat across the sea. He doesn't seek that kind of fame that worldly rulers seek, and yet he's the only one who deserves that kind of fame. So the spiritual discipline for us, and Curtis, I don't know how you feel you're doing. I'd be curious. I probably am doing worse at this the last couple of months than I've done my whole adult life. I have ended up with so much of my attention fixed on our current rulers.
Yeah.
Um, and yeah, I've thought more about the face of our president than I ever have in my life. And that is in a direct, like, zero sum competition for my ability to keep my gaze fixed on the Lord Jesus and who he is and what he promises and how he promises it and who he is for me and who he is for all of us. And that's the great challenge right now is when you're absolutely surrounded by mechanisms of attention and people seeking attention through those mechanisms, to focus on the one who decided never to employ any of those mechanisms. Like, he did not ever have his portrait made, even. Like, we
Yeah.
don't actually know what the face of Jesus looks like. And in fact, if you take Matthew, what is it, 25, right? The sheep and the goats,
Yeah.
like, the people who actually served him the way he wishes to be served, when they see him in his resurrection, they're like, when did we ever see you before? We don't even recognize you. He's like, well,
Mm.
that's because I came in all these disguises, right? So
Yeah.
anyway,
No, I'm
all right,
like you,
yeah,
Andy. And I think like most people have not done so very well in terms of keeping my attention on the proper things. This is really a big reason for this particular conversation. Is it feels like something is off in
yeah,
terms of our attention, and uh, even if you have very strong, good reasons to object to what he's doing, the level of preoccupation and sense of catastrophe and alarm,
yes,
uh,
yes,
you just get the sense that something's, and I can't quite put my finger on it, which is partly why I wanted to have this conversation,
mm,
because these are real, like, you and I probably have some of the same friends who have lost jobs or have had their
yeah,
programs cut, and so it's not like this is inconsequential, and yet it occupies a brain space that feels like this is too much. So, um,
wow.
Andy, can you talk about like what do you think has happened that in the political realm that reveals something about our world that's really important to consider? Not just an immediate impact of a policy, but it's
Mm,
revealing something that maybe that allowed that policy to happen or allowed this political dynamic to take place that actually is longer term than the specific policy itself.
yeah. Two things have been emerging for me as kind of deep themes that this political moment is bringing to a head, but that actually have been underway for a couple decades. I think at least. I mean, I'm sure there's even deeper or longer waves going on, but I think I can almost specifically identify when these two things became dominant features of our life, our political life in a new way, and they're all just kind of coming to fruition in these months. So the first is the state of emergency, and the use of emergency as a kind of motivator for political action in the absence of the ability to get anything done without an emergency. So I think, I mean, very concretely, President Trump has used very novel legal interpretations of emergency powers to justify a number of things that no one ever before thought would could be done, um, by the president. Such as the tariffs policy, which normally this is something that's done with a lot of deliberation through a lot of negotiations and treaties, and a lot of acts of Congress are involved. And really, the reason that the president asserts that he can now rewrite trade policy is because we're in an emergency with every one of our trading partners in the world. That's quite an amazing claim. It will be tested probably ultimately. Um, but I think what's more notable than even whether that claim is, will stand up legally, is the underlying idea that we act in conditions that suspend normal life and require hasty, dramatic, um, in some ways, like there's no time to think in an emergency. You just act on instinct to rescue what is in danger of being lost. And I think that way of thinking. So let me illustrate it with another thing. So one of the things that got caught up in the early actions of the administration was this thing called PEPFAR. It's often known by its acronym. But the acronym means the President's Emergency Program for AIDS Relief. It was instituted by the Bush administration, the George W. Bush administration in 2003, if I remember right. And it was in response to a real crisis, which was the neglect of AIDS on the African continent, which really was related to the stigmatization of AIDS as a gay disease, because it was seen as just a disease that afflicted a certain subpopulation in the West, a stigmatized population. We were missing the fact that actually it's transmitted by any intimate activity, any sexual activity, not just gay sexual activity, and that this was causing an absolute devastating crisis in Africa. And in a pretty amazing set of circumstances in which Christians played, I think, a really beautiful role in the end, was rolled out this program to provide antiretroviral medications and other medication treatments, to really bring to a halt the devastation of AIDS in Africa, which affects the whole world. And so this program is now 20 years old, and it was caught up in the uh, defenestration of the USAID, which administered the program, even though it wasn't authorized under USAID. And and we can talk about that, as much as we want. What I think is so striking is that this is a 22-year-old program that is still called the President's Emergency Program. Now, AIDS is a terrible thing, and a diagnosis of AIDS in the absence of treatment is an emergency for any individual. And in 2003, it was also a global emergency, legitimately. But we have not been able to say, kind of as a nation, as policymakers, even as Congress, to say, this is no longer an emergency. It is a chronic reality of our world that we now have this retrovirus in our world, and we need to manage it well, and we need to have long-term interventions. But that is not the kind of thing we can do as a nation right now. Everything we do has to be justified by it's an emergency. It's an emergency. So emergency is one dramatic feature of our moment. Um, the Another dramatic feature is, and this is a little more high octane one in a way, is contempt. Contempt is an attitude primarily towards people that says this person is beneath my consideration. Their dignity is beneath my consideration. Their interests are beneath my consideration. Their humanity is that they have disqualified themselves by something about them from my demonstrating regard for their humanity. And unfortunately, I think this is about a 20-year story of public life in America that has maybe not perfectly, like, monotonically, as they say, like, I'm not sure it's steadily gotten worse and worse, but I think over decades, there has been more and more permission in American life to treat certain groups of people as if they don't just do not even deserve the dignity of, basic respect. They are to be, um, neglected, uh, demeaned. They can be freely belittled because they are not like us. They are not one of us, and frankly, they're a threat to us, and therefore all they deserve from us. But it's not like you can have, like, respect for a worthy opponent. They're not even worthy opponents. They're unworthy enemies, unworthy of our attention, unworthy of our respect. And I don't think you have to disagree with some of the policy goals of this or any administration, but this one in particular, to see that among the things that Donald Trump and many around him are incredibly good at, like masters of, is conveying contempt. Um, it's all the little nicknames for people that demean them and often literally treat them as small, diminutive nicknames. It's tones of voice. And he's just, and it's mesmerizing on, in media, by the way, like, to see someone treating other people with that, like, it's a great display of bravado and power. And if you kind of, and whichever side you're on, like on the receiving end or the, like, the ally, and like, oh, he's actually going after the people I also fear and dislike. It's kind of mesmerizing. But while Donald Trump is a master of it in some ways, I think this has become like a widespread affliction that others have done in more, with more politesse. So no leader is as sort of polished and in a certain way careful and, like, university approved as Barack Obama. But people who are not of his elite kind of formation, and who especially were on the other side of certain issues in our society, felt from Barack Obama what I think was an undisciplined, lack of respect when he spoke about certain populations. And of course, this most often happens when it's supposed to be off the record. And a famous phrase was people who are clinging to their guns and their religion. But it wasn't just the phrase. It's he carried himself with a kind of hauteur, a kind of, a level of self-confidence that implied that certain other people were not part of that, could not have access to that. But I think it actually goes back, if I can be so specific and provocative, I think the first person I saw demonstrate this in public life was not George W. Bush, who I don't think had an ounce of contempt for others in his soul, or no more than any human being. We all are tempted by this. But his vice president, Dick Cheney, carried himself publicly with a contempt towards his opponents that I think was genuinely new in the highest
Mm.
levels of leadership of American life. And not everyone will agree with this, perhaps, but that's my own judgment. Is that about 20 years ago, in a new way, we started seeing it be legitimate for, like, significant leaders to treat others in in our own society and our opponents, or even sometimes our allies, our sometime allies, with contempt. And I think that's carried through every single, like, major public development since, and it's just become more and more allowed. Um, so to me, those are the two kind of deep trends, that we are, seeing in a very heightened way in one way, but in another way, they've been very present for a long time now in our politics. And it almost seems like this is just the way it is. Things only get done if there's an emergency, and you cannot count on being treated with respect by people who are on the other side of any given, whether it's a border or an issue, or, what you believe about a given policy.
All right, we've been talking with Andy Crouch, and he's talking about some long-term trends that go further back than just this few months of the Trump administration. But I'm going to talk about the emergency first. Andy, in things that I've seen you write, you've talked about this distinction between an emergency or a crisis and what Tish Harrison Warren calls an affliction. Can you talk about that and why that's a kind of an important for us to distinction for us to have if we're going to make sense of the world?
Yeah, I found this so illuminating in Tish's book, Prayer in the Night, which is a meditation on a prayer that's used in the final service of the day, called Compline. There's a line in the prayer that asks God to pity the afflicted. So she spends a chapter just reflecting on what affliction is, and she makes this incredibly valuable distinction between affliction and crisis, which is another word for emergency, of course. And the difference is, a crisis is something like you break a bone, like suddenly something's out of joint, and also a crisis is something often that can be repaired quickly if you get the help you need. Um, an affliction is something more like you learn that you have or someone you love has dementia, and that is probably not going to be cured. And just very gradually over let's say a long stretch of time, it's going to be hard, and it's going to get harder possibly. And she basically says American Christians are great at helping each other at moments of crisis, and we really are not great at helping each other in the afflictions of our lives, the things that are not going away, that are the pains that we just have to bear and bear with others, that everyone shows up with the casseroles, like when something terrible happens.
Right.
But if you learn that for the rest of your life you're going to be caring, say, for a child who has a disability that we don't expect will be cured, right? You are going to be, on average, pretty lonely
Yeah.
about a month into that and for the rest of that experience,
Yeah,
because
it's
we
true.
just don't have a framework for helping with the things that can be born with enough community and support and prayer and spiritual growth, but that they're chronic. They're not solvable. Um, and I think another way in which what's happening right now is a lot of stuff is happening very fast, but it's addressing things that are actually afflictions in our world that we've been very bad at attending to. And whether that's the afflictions of communities that have seen gradual disinvestment because the economy shifts, and any given place cannot necessarily keep up with shifts in what generates value in a global economy, right? So this is sort of very crudely put, the evaporation of manufacturing and that kind of thing. Whether it's race in the United States, which is both, when we have these acute moments, and obviously in 2020 with the murder of George Floyd, there was this incredible acute moment. But the problem with focusing on the acute moment and fixating on that case is that you lose the fact that this is an affliction of our country that literally goes back to the very beginning of how we sort of set up the architecture of it. And to focus on the crises and the emergencies is actually to undermine the ability to bear with, like, the chronic pain that's present in everyone in the system in a way, and that we've never learned to really handle. So I don't know. Does that help, like, illuminate that?
I mean, it seems like that's something that you would have to say, like, look, these afflictions go back multiple generations, the loss of manufacturing, race,
Yes.
whatever, like and this sort of helpfully takes us out of the sort of right, left, Republican, Democratic kind of lens, because clearly these are multiple administrations that have been unable to address with any attention, over the long term, these long term problems, right?
Yes. 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 And it- it's made worse first by the fact that the only way they get addressed is when they're raised to the level of a crisis. That actually undermines the ability to do the longer thing. It's it's also, I think, well, w- the to my mind, one of the best books, not the only book worth reading by any means, but one of the great books, very neglected books about the issue of race in America, is a book that Wendell Berry wrote in the 1960s called The Hidden Wound. And it's about the way that the kind of um, inscribing of racism and the racialization of American life wounded people who were racialized as white. That is, they were we came to call ourselves, people like me came to call ourselves white in this story. And of course, you think of the white people, the sort of standard account, if you sort of have a typical account of racism, they're the ones who benefit from racism. And I'm not saying there isn't truth to that, and certainly Wendell Berry is not saying that. But what he's writing about in The Hidden Wound is all the ways that actually there's affliction in the population that come to think of themselves as white, and even that perpetrate direct violence, because some of his own ancestors were people who perpetrated violence in the name of race as a white Southerner, as were some of my ancestors, by the way, and that there's a suffering that goes with that as well. Well, that is, you can see why this book is not widely read, because it so complicates the story of, oppressors and oppressed, and benefit, people who benefit and people who are who lose in this. And it's not to say people don't benefit and people aren't uh oppressed. It's just that the story is one of a shared affliction
Yeah.
that we are all going to have to come to terms with and be healed from, rather than sort of a right wrong, a thing that comes into focus in these moments of crystallized moral outrage. And it's harder to have moral outrage about an affliction than about an emergency.
Well, it's also
uh,
harder to have contempt for somebody who's suffering from an affliction, right? I mean, this gets to your second
huh.
point that I think it's very hard to understand the rise of Donald Trump and his supporters without understanding their own sense that they had been viewed by contempt,
With
with
yes,
contempt by the
yes,
racialized narrative you're talking about.
yes, and some of it's racial, some of it's economic, some of it's
Yeah.
class, some of it's being a real estate developer in Manhattan when all the real powerful people are in finance. Like it can even be occupational, and it's yeah. But I tell you, it's the most, anyone who's been on the receiving end of it, and most of us at this point have, like, whichever side you're on, you've felt it. It's like one of the most salient human feelings you'll ever feel, is realizing this other person who matters in my world treats me with disdain. You will never forget that feeling. And unless you are incredibly spiritually mature, you will never rid yourself of the desire to revenge yourself, if
Mhm.
given the chance, on someone who's treated you that way. And I think it's, there's some people listening to this who they'll immediately have one set of actors who come to mind who have treated them with contempt. They're like, yeah, that's so true of Donald Trump. But I'll just tell you, as someone, in certain respects, I felt it maybe most of all from Hillary Clinton, who's a very accomplished politician. And people who are listening to this who are supporters of Clintonian democratic policies and so forth would be like, you've got to be kidding. Like, this was the era of centrism and comity. And I just want to tell you, there are people who felt contempt from the would-be Hillary Clinton administration, for whom a Donald Trump administration was a relief, because even if you didn't believe Donald Trump was going to actually get anything done, you at least believed you would not be on the receiving end of contempt of the kind that is only felt by the recipient of it. It's not felt by the people who share the kind of worldview of the contemptifier, or whoever that person is who
I think
demonstrates
that's a new
contempt.
word, Andy. Contemptifier.
And I feel like I want to say, Curtis, like, I know there are people, maybe some of them who will listen to this,
Yeah.
who have experienced this from me, have felt in some setting that I overlooked their dignity, that I diminished their concerns, because we all are liable to behave in this way. So I don't want to pretend this is a problem only, political leaders have. Like, when I am not fixing my gaze on Jesus and not being truly filled with the fruit of the Spirit, and I'm in some position of power, I have the ability to make other people feel neglected, small, belittled, even when I would say, "Oh, I'm behaving perfectly politely." And that's just such a humbling thing to realize, that I'm capable of conveying that to people.
All right, Andy, we've talked a lot about diagnosing sort of the ills of the world, but what is the Christian hope here? What values can Christians offer to the world that's an alternative to emergency, contempt, all of this sense of, you know, devaluing the people that are around us? Like, what is the Christian hope here?
Well, So I've been thinking about the fruit of the Spirit. I mean, in a way that's going to sound perhaps like a very conventional answer, but I've been thinking some unconventional things about it. So the fruit of the Spirit, I'm not sure. I did not memorize. I didn't go to the right kind of like Sunday school that made you memorize verses. So I'm not going to remember all 7 or whatever it is. But
You didn't have
well,
sword drills, Andy? You didn't?
I did not have. I had no idea there was such a thing as a sword drill
Yeah,
until
yeah.
probably I was in graduate school. And we didn't do them in graduate school either. So love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, self-control. That's at least most of the list. Um, this is what the world needs.
Yeah.
But here's what I've been thinking about these fruit. Trees don't like set out to bear fruit. Plants, fruit bearing plants have no intentionality. The fruit is just the thing that results from it being itself. And so the strange thing I think about these fruits, which what so they are like they are the inverse of crisis and contempt. Patience, gentleness, like these are not things you wield in an emergency.
Yeah,
And
these are
by the way,
long-term
yeah,
attributes that you have to cultivate. Yeah.
that's right. And listen, if you go to the emergency room, you're not asking, is my ER doc or ER nurse like displaying incredible patience and gentleness? Like sometimes they gotta rip you open. Sometimes they have to act really fast. Sometimes they have to leave other people waiting while they care for an emergency. Like in real emergencies, I'm not saying the fruits of the spirit don't matter in the long run, but you know, there are times to act decisively. But if the issues are chronic, then we've got to have these longer term fruits. And it is interesting how all these fruits are not things that just solve things in a moment, or that assist you even in decisive action. They assist you into bringing into being the conditions in the world really for shalom, right? For
Mm,
genuine peace. So love, joy, peace, patience, kindness. The thing is, it's actually very hard to aim at these things directly.
right.
And so instead, what we need is people who are grafted onto a different tree, or a different vine, the vine of Jesus, with our mostly private practices, but although I'm not sure private entirely just by ourselves, but our sort of shared um, n- non-public formation in being like Jesus will lead to the kinds of people who out in public bear these fruits. But I don't think we need like a 7 fruits of the spirit program, to sort of make these more your like the way you lead in the world,
Yeah.
because I think you can't intend them directly. I think to the extent, like at this point in my life, is it the case that fewer people experience me as someone who overlooks their dignity? I sure hope so. But if I think it might even be true just based on what I hear, but maybe it's not. If it's true, it's not because I've pursued like a fruits of the spirit self-improvement program. It's because first of all, I've had a bunch of humbling experiences that make me just more desperate for Jesus to work to save me, right? It's not even to fix me. It's just like rescue me from my
Yeah.
own sin and death. And I've gradually perhaps become a slightly different kind of person, even under pressure. And I, I mean, this seems so inadequate for the state of crisis that lots of people would like us to feel that we're in, and in a way that both sides politically benefit from us feeling like we're in. But I don't know. I think it's like what in the long course of my life, like months, years, decades, is going to form the fruit of the spirit in me. That's what a bunch of us need to be saying. That's the most important thing in my day, rather than whatever urgency is going on.
Andy, how do you balance this from, the sense of just now we're just talking about a privatized gospel, one that does not care about the public square. Um,
Right.
how do we hold this in tension? Because it seems like what's happening is either the public square squelches out this private cultivation of one's spirit that you're talking about, and we're just constantly doom scrolling rather than reading the scriptures or praying or something
Yeah.
like that.
Yeah. Yeah. Right. Right. Right.
Or we sort of say, well, let's not talk about this other stuff that's happening in the world out of a purely privatized depiction of Jesus,
Huh.
which I think any reading of the New Testament would say, no, this Jesus did not just care about one's individual private conversion. He was the kingdom of the world burst into the whole world, which includes
Absolutely.
the public square, right? So how do we in this political moment hold this intention? Because I actually think that's kind of what is at least one of the challenges for anybody trying to navigate where their attention goes to.
Hmm. I do actually believe that in the absence of transformed persons, which doesn't just mean individuals. So in that sense, it's hardly a private thing. For me to become the kind of person who bears the fruit of the Spirit, I'm going to have to be deeply connected to other people.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm going to have to go, by the way, to places that put me into contact with the afflictions of our world, which is a very social thing,
Yeah.
because especially if I'm fortunate and privileged, which I am, I can choose a very privatized life that never comes into contact with the real afflictions of our world. So there is a social dimension of my becoming the kind of person who's humbly dependent on God that's very real.
Yeah.
But I I don't know. I think there was a point in my own life where, in reaction to the individualism of so much of our spirituality, I was very keen to say, well, it's about both private holiness and social justice, and it's not that I don't believe in each of those words in some sense. I will say I've come to believe character is very fundamental, and humility, which is the very heart of character because it's the absolute antidote to the real problem, which is pride, that humility is like the pearl of great price, and it is only acquired one person at a time in a certain sense. Though I do think there are communities that can help us cultivate humility. Um, I I've gotten very wary of solutions that somehow can get the job done without us being personally transformed
Yeah.
into people of genuine fruit-bearing humility. And so in that sense, of course, I'm not saying that you stop being aware of what's happening. I've always thought it takes very little time to be aware
Yeah.
of what's happening at macro level. You don't need articles. Headlines will do. It takes like 2 minutes a day to be adequately informed about the things outside of your circle of influence that you need to, like, somehow know what's going on. Um, it, all the rest is doom scrolling, because most of the rest of your responsibility is within your own circle of influence, and your immediate context, where you're going to be pressed into the question of whether you actually can be a redemptive presence, which frankly, I don't live in Washington, D.C. I don't work in Washington institutions. I can't be a redemptive presence there. I've got a bunch of places and people I need to be a redemptive presence with today. I, it doesn't mean I'm not aware of the whole premise of our conversation is we're both aware of things that are happening outside of our immediate
Yeah.
setting. But I've become very wary of the idea that there's some pro, large scale program we all need to get on board with before we become transformed. I will say an amazing model of this that has been much covered, of course, but it's this moment in American life where something really changes with respect to a very deep affliction, and it's not perfect how it all turns out, but boy, it's a moment of redemptive progress, if we can use that word. And it's the stage in which the civil rights movement is being led by the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and before they go out and march for to make their, to bring their promissory note, as Dr. King said in the March on Washington, to sort of bring the promissory note that has not been cashed and paid, they have these spiritual formation exercises, which we have records of in church basements, where they literally practice forgiving their enemies and loving their enemies. And they go through a checklist that some of these have been preserved. I think Charles Marsh has written about this, these checklists that ask, are you harboring hatred in your heart towards people who are white? Are you prepared to suffer violence and not turn it back? Like, it's the spiritual preparation that happened invisibly before the very visible marches. that was so taken so seriously by the Christian leadership of that era of the civil rights movement, and led to fruit being born in American history that did not solve all the problems or resolve all the crises, and yet was a step change in how this country handled this affliction. Um, I I think, yeah, I just believe, of course you have to be aware. Of course we have concerns and convictions about how justice should play out in the world. And we don't shy back from speaking those aloud and advocating for them insofar as we have political agency. But I just think the deeper thing is, am I being formed into someone who bears the fruit of the Spirit?
Andy, we began this conversation with, the distinction between what Trump is doing to the world and what is revealed about the world through Trump. And I think one thing you're pointing to is just what is desperately needed is deeper spiritual formation, and that transcends, kind of some quick reaction to any particular, to the immigration policy or to deportation or to something else. And that, that's really, if we were to use that word, which I know maybe this is an affliction, but the affliction that the church really needs to wrestle with is the affliction of imperfect spiritual formation. So,
Yes, yes, completely, completely. And it sounds so impotent, when you're faced with a crisis,
yeah.
except that, I mean, this is the way of thinking that goes back in some ways to Aristotle, though it has to be filtered through and reframed in a Christian way. But part of the idea behind the development of the virtues, and I think that's related to the fruit of the Spirit, is not just the virtues, but in a way, it's the deeper Christian vision behind what was always in the thinking about virtue, is that it is what equips you under pressure to act in a different way than everyone around you is acting. And there's every reason to think more crises are going to happen. I mean, the world will always be full of crises, self-made or not. And the question of who we are before we have time to reflect, before, under pressure, is going to be the result of very long formative processes that don't seem to make a difference on any given day. So yeah, and what we are reaping is our own settling for forms of Christian life that don't require you to become truly transformed. And forms of attention to the world that don't require you to be truly transformed. And yeah, so that is I have an email that I need to answer. Hopefully by the time this podcast comes out, I will have answered it, from just a random person who has reason to trust me and reach out to me, who said, how do I act as a Christian in this political moment? And I've been hesitating to answer because I think my answer is, you've got to commit to the formative life, the hidden life of becoming an imitator of Jesus. And that's the answer I think that is ours to give, not here's how we solve this political problem or this political crisis that we may see around us. Yeah.
And may continue for a long time and replaced by the next crisis, like you said.
Yeah.
That's a great word to us all, Andy, that may we all be the kinds of people that take the attention and the time to allow Jesus to form us into the people who reflect his presence, his character in the world. Andy, thank you for joining us for this conversation. And listeners, once again, we will have another conversation for you next week as we gather around the campfire.